means by which the truth would be revealed through experience, not simply through books or hearing people talk. All right, so that was the purpose. There we are 50 years later. That's McDew. He's got a T-shirt that says, "A Negro is a terrible thing to waste." He taught me that humor is part of bravery. The bravest person I ever met and one of the funniest. He was the leader of the Orangeburg student movement, a reluctant leader, and the first chairman of SNCC, and he came directly to Port Huron to participate in writing the stuff about participatory democracy. That's at Orangeburg 50 years later, the two of us. This is Martha Norman Noonan, Ann Arbor student. She was at a Miami Book Festival this year talking about the Port Huron legacy. She's one of those that claims that she had to type it. We don't really know. There's a couple of disputes about how it was produced on the Gestetner. None of you would know what I'm talking about, but there were these devices. And she was so moved by the whole experience that she became a field organizer for SNCC in Greenwood, Mississippi for 5 years. This is her at a reunion this year speaking in Miami. This is, it says Maria Varela. Her name was Mary Varela when she was at Port Huron. She was from the Young Catholic Workers Organization in the Dorothy Day tradition, who taught us a method of participatory democracy that was preceded liberation theology. I came from a Catholic background where you memorized the catechism and then you taught it to other people. She came from a background in which the investigative principles were to observe or witness, investigate, and take responsibility. And so this meant that she would become, she was at Port Huron, she carried these encyclicals around. She then went to Selma and ran the literacy project in keeping with the idea that the full truth would never come forward unless the so-called unqualified discards of society, the poor, were listened to and were engaged, and they would bring forth understandings that the organizers simply didn't have that were absolutely indispensable to moving forward. After the SNCC dissolution or splits later in the 60s, she went to northern New Mexico, where she lives now. She's a longtime photographer whose works have shown in the Smithsonian, longtime organizer and administrator of health clinics in the mountainous areas of northern New Mexico, a major presence for many decades in the Latina and Chicana organizations and movements in the Southwest, and still very much at it today. That's Maria Varela. This was my wife. I can hardly speak of her, but there she is. She too was she was from Austin. She was a sit-in leader. She was a student of Henry David Thoreau, and she challenged us as the famous dialogue between Emerson and Thoreau. What are you doing in there? What are you doing out there? And she was an organizer for SNCC as an observer, working on the payroll of the YWCA out of Atlanta, which was a conduit for foundation funding into voter registration and a fairly safe conduit compared to other options. She is in Tucson now with family and very active in the Occupy movement, and has been very involved in many causes in the Southwest for the past 50 years. And that's me, the future Lenin, right there, staring with his dangerous eyes into the camera. I think this is about looking forward with uncertainty to the future, the opening line of the statement. I was a college editor, nothing more, nothing less. Next. This, we didn't take pictures of ourselves. Figure. Look at these cameras. Hello, hello, hello. We took no pictures of ourselves. There is no picture of us at Port Huron. The building is gone, leveled. There are some individual pictures, black and white, that a few people have. This is the nearest thing. This is actually 1963 in Bloomington, Indiana, 9 months after Port Huron. More or less the same people. You may want to see the fellow there with this dangerous slanty eyes and short hair in the upper middle? We'll see, just keep your eye on him. We'll see in a moment who that turned out to be. Go ahead. This was, on the left is Bob Moses. I mean, on the right is Bob Moses. And on your left is Bob Zellner. Zellner was the descendant of the Klan and from Alabama. And he probably rivals John Lewis as being the most beat up direct action person in the early 60s. He's written a very interesting biography that may become a Spike Lee movie. It's called something at Murder Creek. But he was one of the people that I first met in Macomb on that night in the basement. Bob was also there. Bob became a more iconic figure on the your right there, and he was the leader of the Mississippi Summer Project and the initial organizer of the voter registration projects in Mississippi, starting circa 1960-61. And again, what we learned was that the people who came before were a necessary legacy, and they also welcomed our arrival. Very typically, you go to the backwoods and find a man with a gun in his house, protecting his family, who had been trying to register for 20 years and had belonged secretly to the NAACP and had been organized by Ms. Ella Baker, the field secretary of the NAACP, who became an advisor to SNCC and told them to form their own autonomous student movement. And out of the conversations with these rural people came a conclusion that they wanted the vote above anything else. Many had been in Korea or World War II, and they would say very plaintive things that the organizer can hear if you don't let your agenda get in the way. They would say, all my life, I just want to vote before I die. I've wanted to vote. I want to vote. And when you have that resonance and that emotion and that pain, that's the stuff out of which movements come, in which people will last. They will do what it would take, and they would typically say, welcome, you know, where you been? We've been waiting for you so long. And we would say, we're here now. Sorry, sorry we weren't here before. It's just that kind of chemistry, and he very much embodied this sort of Socratic organizing principle that's at the root of participatory democracy. Okay, we can go on. That's Al Haber. You might think that that is Maimonides, but it's Al Haber. Circa 1960. Al Haber was the madman who founded SDS. He came from a social democratic legacy, Ann Arbor, New Deal. His father was involved in the New Deal, and he had it in his blood, Al did, and he joined up a shell of an organization that was funded by some in the labor movement called the League for Industrial Democracy. It had been, one of its inspirers had been John Dewey. We'll get to him in a moment. But LID wanted an SLID. They wanted a student branch. They didn't want an autonomous student movement, but they saw something was happening on the campuses, and they thought that they could buy some staff and that we could recruit people on the campuses to be members of something like the Young People's Socialist League, something. I don't know what the scheme was, but these were people who had reached the peak of their powers about 1937, and the best you could say about them, and it's a lot, was that they helped midwife the organization into existence. But they became soon horrified that young Al and others wanted to end the Cold War. You think the implication of ending the Cold War would mean that you couldn't ban people with communist associations from your organization, because if you couldn't relate to them at an SDS meeting, how could you relate to the Soviet Union and end the Cold War? Coexistence was, I think, we were premature advocates of peaceful coexistence in campus activity and globally. Well, this just infuriated them, and we were soon fired. They cut our checks, they locked the doors, and we were on our own, almost strangled to death within days after the euphoric experience of writing the Port Huron Statement. Al's got a lot on his mind. This is Sharon Jeffrey. This is, could be a photograph at Port Huron. On her left is Richard Magadoff, but her importance is not simply in her own right, but her mother was Mildred Jeffrey, who was the close political lieutenant of Walter Reuther, of the Reuther brothers, who ran the United Auto Workers, which was the dominant union in the place I grew up after my family was forced to flee Wisconsin as economic refugees, that is Detroit. So whenever we were in trouble and needed money or help from the elders, the call would go out to Sharon's mother, who was invariably on the road with Walter Reuther, doing good things. And they were very close to John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, much closer than we could exactly imagine. But through her mother, during the Port Huron time, all doors were open in a way that you would find absolutely remarkable. It would make you lose your balance if you understood one simple thing. They got us the camp. We couldn't find a place to meet. They got us the labor camp at Port Huron a week before the meeting. But a more astounding thing is that when we finished the document and printed it up in that lovely format, one of the things that Al and I did, we put on ties and we drove to Washington seeking to present it to John Kennedy in case there was an opportunity that he might endorse it. We got as far, because of Mildred, we got as far as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And I don't remember anything about the meeting except that we just talked and talked and talked to lay out the whole plan. Because there was a part in this plan for Kennedy. We were that, you talk about the audacity of audacity. This was really out there. And we left it on his desk, and it circulated in the administration, and there was a time period from 60 to 63 when the ideas in the Port Huron Statement were percolating around the White House and the upper levels of Congress. We'll get to that in a moment. But Sharon went more into the counterculture later. She lives in California now, and she's written a piece for the book. Next. There we go. That's Jim Monsonis. He's a little shaggier now, but that's the way he was. Now, the importance of Monsonis is this. You've never heard of him. He went to divinity school. He was the head of something which doesn't exist anymore called the National Young Christian Association. And his job at Port Huron was to write the section of the Port Huron Manifesto covering religion and its sins and the need for a new participatory faith and spirituality. Whether it was a strange mixture of Zen Buddhism, Christian existentialism, anti-Reinhold Niebuhr Christianity, social gospel, black Southern churches, but there was a religious spirit that was more powerful than any ideological spirit in the room. And this writing went on. I mean, we only had 5 days to complete the agenda for the generation. There was a lot on the table. So at the end of this 5th day, everybody's been awake for a week. At the end of the 5th day, everybody is either asleep or passing the document by acclamation and sending it back to me for rewriting. And Monsonis is in the category of those who are asleep. He slept through the final session at Port Huron, and therefore the passages about religion never made their way into the document. However, be of little faith, I know that you've been waiting a long time. The word on religion is coming. Monsonis remembers everything with absolute clarity, has consulted with everybody who was there, including myself, and has now written what we would have said, word for word, to be included in the edition of the statement coming out in September. That's why at the end of the document, the emphasis was on, this is a living document for dialogue for future generations. Quite different than other manifestos, which I will not name. It was a living, open-ended framework for discussion. Okay, that's Jim. Now here's that cunning-looking fellow you saw in the back of the Bloomington picture. That's how